Some secrets lie quiet for decades, until a single name softly spoken brings them back to life. In a village where silence once passed for kindness, one woman's quiet return stirs the waters beneath the bridge. What's remembered, what's concealed, and what's forgiven may not be the same. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The late morning sun sifted through the lace curtains in Jessica Fletcher's kitchen, casting patterned light across the table where a pot of Earl Grey and her latest manuscript draft waited patiently. She had intended to spend the next hour revising a particularly stubborn chapter, but Cabot Cove, in its gentle way, had other plans. A knock at the screen door signaled the arrival of mail, and with it, a small diversion. Jessica rose, tucked her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, and retrieved the modest pile from the porch railing. Among the familiar bills and local flyers, one envelope stood apart, ivory paper, hand-addressed in elegant cursive, no return address. She frowned gently, the way one does when confronted with something both pleasant and strange. Taking her tea to the armchair by the window, she examined the envelope again. The handwriting stirred something, a vague recognition, almost like scent. She opened it carefully. The letter inside was short, no more than a page, but already it began to shift the quiet of her morning. There was a name near the bottom, Eleanor Grange, and the moment Jessica read it, the familiar comfort of Cabot Cove gave way to the restless edges of memory. The letter, written in a poised yet slightly hesitant hand, began with warm recollections of a distant time, and a man Jessica hadn't expected to think of that morning. Eleanor Grange, it said, hoped Jessica would consider attending a small commemorative ceremony in Sycamore Glen, where a long-forgotten footbridge had recently been restored. The bridge, apparently, held some special meaning to Eleanor. She wrote of it as a place woven with quiet courage, and mentioned Jessica's late husband Frank by name, not as an afterthought, but as though he were stitched into the very wood of its railings. Jessica read the letter twice, then a third time more slowly, absorbing its peculiar tone, part nostalgia, part confession. Eleanor had been a friend of Frank's during the war, that much Jessica remembered, but they'd never met in person, and Frank had rarely spoken of her. At the end of the letter was a single line, underlined once, "I believe the past has waited long enough, Jessica. Will you come?" Jessica folded the letter with care, as if it might break. She looked out across her garden, but her thoughts had already crossed a state line, heading south, toward a bridge she'd never seen. Frank had mentioned Eleanor Grange only once, in the middle of a snowstorm, years ago, when the power had gone out, and they'd shared whiskey by candlelight. He'd spoken of her in the way old soldiers sometimes did, sparingly, with reverence tucked behind restraint. Jessica remembered asking, was she a nurse, and Frank shaking his head with a half-smile. No, just someone who made the hard days feel less impossible. And then he had gone quiet. Now, with Eleanor's letter in her lap, and the sound of gulls wheeling above the harbor, Jessica replayed that conversation, each word newly tinged with meaning. Had there been more to Frank's story than she knew? A friendship never fully spoken, a kindness never explained. She wasn't the sort to indulge in jealousy over the past. Life had its private chapters, even in marriage. Still, something about the letter, the undercurrent of urgency, made her feel as though a thread had come loose in the tapestry of her understanding, not of Frank alone, but of the world he carried inside him. And if there was one thing Jessica Fletcher couldn't resist, it was the sound of a story asking, gently but insistently, to be told. Jessica opened her notebook and jotted down the name Sycamore Glen, Windham County, a place that until this morning had never crossed her path. She moved to the desk, opened her small laptop, and began her quiet ritual of research, a habit formed more by novels than mysteries. Sycamore Glen had no official website, just scattered mentions in regional historical archives, and a few black-and-white photographs in local newspaper clippings. The town was nestled in a bend of the river, surrounded by fields and old sycamores, its population unchanged for decades. There was one article from 1948, yellowed with time and thin on detail. It referenced a civic beautification project, and in passing, a minor disturbance at the river crossing. No names, no elaboration. Jessica leaned back. A disturbance, a bridge, a dedication, half a century later. Whatever had happened in Sycamore Glen hadn't made it past the county line, but it had, clearly, never left Eleanor's mind. And now, through this letter, it had found its way to hers. The town seemed small, self-contained, almost stubborn in its silence. But it had opened its door just a crack. And Jessica, by instinct, was already leaning forward. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, rustling the tops of the trees outside Jessica's window. The kettle let out a soft whistle, and she poured herself a second cup of tea, darker now, with a slice of lemon. The letter from Eleanor lay open on the table beside her, its ink beginning to soften along the fold. She stared at it for a long moment, before turning to the calendar pinned by her phone. The date of the ceremony was circled in light blue, less than 2 weeks away. Jessica was not one to rush toward the unknown, but this didn't feel like impulse. It felt like respect. And perhaps something more elusive, the subtle pull of unfinished lines in someone else's story. She thought again of Frank's half-spoken memory, of Eleanor's words, "The past has waited long enough," and of the peculiar sensation that she'd just been offered not an invitation, but a responsibility. She stood, tea in hand, and crossed the room to the small leather suitcase she used only when travel felt personal. She placed the letter gently atop it. Her decision had been made, not from obligation, but from a question she hadn't yet named. The next morning brought sunlight and the quiet rhythm of packing. Jessica folded a modest selection of clothes into her case, her fingers lingering on a soft grey scarf Frank had once given her. Practical, he'd said. Good for crosswinds and second thoughts. She smiled faintly at the memory, though her heart tugged in that familiar way it always did when he came too close to thought. Returning to her writing desk, she slid the letter back into its envelope, but paused as she did. Her eyes returned to that final line, "Some things are better honored than forgotten." The phrasing caught her again, not because of its sentiment, but because of its careful ambiguity. It didn't say remembered or celebrated. It said honored, and it spoke of forgetting not as a failure, but as a choice. Jessica read it aloud once, softly. There was an ache beneath those words. Not melodrama, but the quiet gravity of someone who had lived with silence too long. Something had happened in Sycamore Glen, not just at the bridge, but beneath it, beside it, around it. And someone had decided long ago not to speak of it. But secrets, Jessica knew, didn't stay buried forever. They had a way of rising, not with thunder, but with a whisper, in a letter, a name, or a pause between sentences. She zipped her bag and reached for her coat. It was time to follow the whisper. The road into Sycamore Glen curved lazily through meadows, then narrowed between two great sycamore trees, their silvery bark catching the afternoon light. Jessica leaned forward slightly in the passenger seat of the town car, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was something about first impressions, not just of people, but of places, that she never took lightly. The village itself looked almost suspended in time. Brick storefronts with old wooden signs, a barber pole that still turned, gardens fenced with whitewashed pickets. And yet, for all its postcard charm, Jessica felt it almost at once, a tension in the air, like a room that had just gone quiet when someone entered. As the car pulled to a stop near the inn, she caught a glance from a woman standing by a postbox. The woman smiled politely, then looked away quickly, as though she'd remembered she wasn't supposed to greet strangers too warmly. Jessica stepped out and took in the scent of fresh-cut grass, of something faintly floral beneath it. She adjusted the strap of her purse. Yes, it was beautiful, this Sycamore Glen, but it wasn't at ease with itself. Not yet. The Sycamore Glen Inn was a lovely old house of pale yellow clapboard and blue shutters. It sat neatly on the edge of the green, with ivy crawling up one side, and the faint scent of lemon polish lingering in the front hall. Jessica signed the guest book, her name appearing just beneath a previous entry that had been scratched out and rewritten. "Mrs. Fletcher," said the innkeeper, a woman in her 60s with carefully styled hair and a silk scarf that didn't quite hide the nervous twitch in her jaw. "We've put you in the garden room, lovely light in the morning." Jessica offered her usual warm smile. "It's a beautiful town. You must be excited about the rededication." The woman paused, the corner of her mouth pulling slightly before she recovered. "Yes, well, it's overdue, I suppose. Some folks feel more strongly than others." "Did you know Eleanor Grange?" Jessica asked lightly. Another pause. "Of course, everyone does. She's one of ours." And then, as if the conversation had wandered somewhere it shouldn't, the innkeeper glanced behind her, lowered her voice, and added, "It'll be good when it's over. Things'll settle again." Jessica thanked her and carried her bag upstairs, more curious than ever. Jessica didn't have to wait long to see Eleanor Grange. A note had been slipped under her door within the hour. "Come if you're settled. No need to dress." The Grange house stood just beyond the village square, cloaked in weeping willows and surrounded by lilacs on the edge of bloom. Eleanor herself answered the door. She was slender, elegant, with a posture that spoke of discipline, but her face, fine-boned, intelligent, had the distant look of someone still walking through a conversation that ended years ago. "Jessica," she said, reaching for her hand. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't either," Jessica replied gently, "but your letter felt unfinished." Eleanor led her to a small sitting room where the furniture seemed older than the house. They spoke for a while, touching on Frank's memory, tenderly, carefully, and the years since. But when Jessica mentioned the bridge, Eleanor's voice grew quieter, her fingers tightening around the edge of her teacup. "There are memories," she said, "that deserve daylight, but not all of them do well in crowds." Jessica didn't press further, but as she left, she couldn't help but wonder what had happened at that bridge, so long ago that still trembled in Eleanor's voice. The town's library stood beside the church, small, dignified, and built of grey stone that caught the afternoon sun. It was there, on her second day in Sycamore Glen, that Jessica was introduced to three of the village's most prominent residents. First was Reverend Harlan Cobb, a warm-faced man with a polished cadence and a well-worn Bible always close at hand. "You're here for the dedication," he said, offering her a smile that felt almost rehearsed. "It's a rare pleasure to host a writer in our midst." Next came Walter Briggs, once the county judge, now retired and still wearing his dignity like a robe. He was courteous but distant, with a gaze that seemed to measure intent more than conversation. "The bridge means different things to different people," he said, his voice low. "That's all I'll say." And finally Naomi Elkins, once a nurse, now a quietly devout woman with pale eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she poured the tea. When Jessica asked if she remembered Eleanor's brother, Naomi's lips pressed together in silence before she offered a flat, "Of course, we all did." Jessica watched each of them closely, noting what wasn't said as much as what was. The bridge hung in every conversation like a shadow, not of tragedy, exactly, but of something unresolved. Something kept, perhaps too long, behind polite smiles and folded hands. Later that afternoon, Jessica walked alone down the river path. The town had emptied into itself for the evening, curtains drawn, windows glowing with domestic routine. Only the sycamores whispered above. She reached the footbridge just as the light began to soften into amber. It was a lovely structure, clean lines, wooden railings, a soft creak beneath her steps. But there was a silence here that didn't feel peaceful. Halfway across, she paused. A figure stood at the far end, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat collar turned up against the breeze. He hadn't noticed her. He looked not down into the water, but out, as if trying to remember something, or waiting for it to reappear. Jessica didn't speak. Something in his stillness asked not to be interrupted. A moment later, he turned and walked away without a glance. There was no rush in his stride, no aggression, but Jessica's instinct stirred. There was weight in that man's presence, not just physical, but emotional, the way he stood. The stillness in his hands, she filed it away, not as evidence, not yet, but as something that didn't match the quiet picture this village was trying, so very carefully, to keep intact. Jessica retraced her steps from the bridge with quiet thought. She took a different path through the village square, where twilight was settling and porch lights blinked on like small stars. The man she'd seen, whoever he was, had vanished into the hush of Sycamore Glen, but others had noticed him. Near the grocer's, two older women paused mid-conversation as he passed, their faces drawn tight. One glanced after him, then turned away sharply, her hand trembling at her coat button. They didn't speak again until he was out of sight. Jessica slowed, pretending to study the jars in the shop window, though her attention stayed with the retreating man and the silence he left behind. She caught sight of Reverend Cobb on the far side of the square. He, too, had seen the man. His fingers gripped the edge of his hymn book, knuckles pale against the leather. Jessica could swear he muttered something, a name maybe, but the wind carried it away before she could catch it. No one approached the stranger. No one greeted him. In a town this small, Jessica knew, a stranger was rarely truly unknown. His presence didn't spark curiosity, it sparked memory and fear. As she returned to the inn, her mind replayed the wordless glances, the tension sewn into shoulders and brows. Someone in this village knew that man, knew why he had come, and perhaps feared what he'd come to uncover. The bell above the tea-room door gave a soft chime as the man entered. Jessica looked up from her table near the window, her hand pausing halfway to her cup. He was tall, with a lean build and a weathered coat that suggested long travel. There was something about his gait, controlled, deliberate, that drew attention without asking for it. The chatter in the room dwindled, not to silence, but to a murmur that lingered awkwardly. Several of the locals stole glances, then quickly returned to their plates. One woman at the counter lowered her gaze entirely. Jessica watched him approach the hostess, a young woman with auburn curls who instinctively straightened her apron. He spoke softly, his voice too low to hear, and was led to a table just two down from her own. He ordered tea, declined food, and sat with his hands folded, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity, not hostile, but searching, as if every wall and patron might hold something he'd come to retrieve. Jessica took a small sip of her own tea, and glanced discreetly over the rim of her cup. She had a feeling this man hadn't come for a warm drink, and the town knew it. Eleanor Grange entered the tea-room just moments later. She moved with her usual composure, but when her eyes fell upon the stranger, she halted for the briefest second. not long enough for most to notice, but Jessica did. The man rose from his seat, polite, perhaps rehearsed. "Mrs. Grange," he said. His tone was smooth, even formal, but Jessica detected something beneath it. Not urgency, exactly, but pressure, as if the words had been waiting behind his teeth. Eleanor hesitated, then stepped forward. "Yes," she replied, her voice thinner than usual. "I'm Dominic Reeves. I believe we're connected." There was a pause in which nothing in the room moved, not even the silver teaspoons. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, her breath catching before she answered. "I don't believe we've met." "No," he said, "but I've read your name more times than I can count." Jessica watched closely. Eleanor's hands, always steady, now trembled as she reached for the chair opposite Dominic's and sat. The conversation continued in quiet tones, but the emotional shift was unmistakable. Whatever had just passed between them, it hadn't been introduction, it had been recognition and denial. Jessica couldn't hear every word, but the cadence of the exchange between Dominic and Eleanor rose just enough to carry fragments across the tea room. "I came for answers," Dominic said plainly. "About the bridge. About 1948. Eleanor looked as though she had aged in the space of 2 breaths. "That was a long time ago," she replied, voice brittle. "You were there," Dominic pressed, his eyes locked onto hers. "You and your brother, and a child who disappeared." Jessica's spoon paused over her saucer. "I was a child myself," Eleanor said, and now her voice carried, not anger, but a pleading fatigue. "What you think you know is tangled in stories others told, stories meant to protect." "Protect who?" Dominic asked. "Because it wasn't me." A hush fell over the room. Conversations at neighboring tables had faded, attention now trained, subtly but fully, on the pair. Jessica glanced about. No one spoke, but several pairs of eyes flicked downward. The room, suddenly, was full of people who weren't listening. Eleanor rose. "You shouldn't have come." Dominic remained seated, but his voice followed her like a trailing echo. "I've spent 30 years wondering where I came from. I'm not leaving without the truth." Jessica watched Eleanor's retreating figure. Her shoulders were rigid, her exit silent, but there was something unmistakable in her expression. Fear, yes, but not of him, of what he might uncover. As Eleanor pushed open the door and stepped out, the tea room exhaled, a breath it had held too long, yet no one resumed their conversations. A clinking spoon here, a cough there, all performed with the exaggerated quiet of people pretending not to have heard what they couldn't unhear. Jessica let her eyes drift. At a corner table, Walter Briggs adjusted his napkin twice before finally folding it and standing. His expression was unreadable, but his exit felt purposeful. Near the counter, Naomi Elkins sat unmoving, her cup untouched. Her gaze hadn't followed Eleanor, it had fixed, unwaveringly, on Dominic. Jessica returned her attention to him. He sat still, but not comfortably. His fingers tapped lightly against the side of his cup, a rhythm neither fast nor slow, but steady, like someone who had waited years, and could wait longer, if he had to. The waitress returned to refill Jessica's tea, but her hand trembled just enough to spill a drop. "Sorry," she muttered. Then, leaning slightly, added under her breath, "He shouldn't have come back." Jessica turned gently. "Come back." But the girl was already gone, fleeing to the kitchen with cheeks flushed. There were many kinds of silence in a small town. This one, Jessica thought, had teeth. That evening, just before the street lamps flickered to life, Jessica took a quiet walk past the church and down toward the river path. The town was settling into dusk, its houses cloaked in amber windows and early supper scents. As she reached the bend near the sycamores, she paused. Ahead, Dominic Reeves was walking alone, the same steady gait, shoulders squared against the cool wind. He carried nothing, not even a coat, just his frame outlined against the deepening sky. He moved toward the bridge with a sense of purpose, but without haste, as though the structure called to him, not just as a place, but as a memory. Jessica kept her distance, watching as he stopped at the center, hands resting on the rail. He leaned slightly forward, not to peer down, but to look out, across the water, the fields beyond, the darkening horizon, as if searching for something just out of reach. A moment passed, then he turned, slowly, and walked back in the direction he'd come. He did not see Jessica, or if he did, he gave no sign. She remained still long after he was gone, listening to the wind stirring the sycamore leaves like an old conversation, waiting to be remembered. The scream came at dawn. Jessica was already awake, the early light filtering through lace curtains, when a sharp cry broke the village's stillness. Then footsteps, a shout, the clanging of a bell that hadn't rung in years. By the time she reached the river path, a small crowd had gathered at the bridge. 2 local officers stood at the edge, their expressions grim. The baker's assistant wept openly beside them. Jessica stepped carefully forward. "What's happened?" One of the officers, a soft-spoken man with a mustache and sorrow in his eyes, answered without looking at her. "Man found at the bottom of the embankment. No ID, but someone recognized him from the tea room yesterday." "Dominic Reeves," Jessica said quietly. He nodded. "No signs of violence?" she asked. "No bruises, no blood. Nothing obvious, just the fall." Jessica looked at the rail. There were no scuffs, no footprints visible in the damp morning grass. Nothing to suggest a struggle or a stumble. But something was wrong, not with the scene itself, but with the stillness around it, because people weren't shocked. They were silent, still, as if they'd already braced for this, or had feared it all along. By midday, the town had resumed its quiet routine, but the rhythm had changed. Conversations took place in hushed tones, glances passed like folded notes, and doorways were watched longer than necessary. Jessica walked slowly through the square, noting how even those who hadn't known Dominic spoke his name with caution. He was asking about the bridge, someone murmured at the grocer's. "Digging," said another, as though that word alone explained everything. At the post office, an elderly man folded his newspaper twice before muttering, "Best to leave the past alone." Jessica paused by the garden fence near the inn. A single name echoed in her mind: Dominic Reeves, a stranger by presence, but not by purpose. The town hadn't killed him, not with violence, but perhaps, Jessica thought, with silence. And in Sycamore Glen, silence had history. The Sycamore Glen Library sat just off the village green, a modest brick building with ivy growing over one shutter and a brass handle polished smooth by generations. Jessica stepped inside, drawn more by instinct than plan. The air smelled of old pages and lavender polish, and there was a hush to the place that felt deliberate. Jessica made her way past shelves of genealogies and local poetry chapbooks, until she reached a narrow corridor marked Historical Archives. The door was unlocked, but bore a sign that read Staff Only. She knocked lightly before stepping in. It was a small room, windowless, filled with cabinets, index boxes, and the gentle sigh of a space that hadn't been disturbed in a while. A single desk lamp burned at the far end, and behind it sat a woman with ash-blonde hair pinned back in a bun, spectacles perched on her nose. She looked up as Jessica entered, not startled, but not entirely welcoming either. "I'm looking into the village's post-war history," Jessica said softly. Around 1948. The woman blinked slowly, then stood smoothing her skirt. Then I suppose you're looking for me. Her tone was neither warm nor cold, just tired. Marla Penn, the woman introduced herself, offering a handshake that was light, almost reluctant. I'm the librarian and the unofficial archivist. Most folks don't come asking about 1948. I'm not most folks, Jessica replied gently. There was a man, Dominic Reeves. He came here recently, asked questions. Now he's dead. Marla's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened subtly around a pencil. Yes, I heard. Jessica waited. Silence, she'd learned, often did the heavy lifting. Finally, Marla moved to one of the cabinets and pulled open a drawer, sifting through manila folders with careful precision. Everything from that year is in here. At least, everything people allowed to be kept. Allowed? Jessica echoed. Some records went missing over time, or were never filed properly. She retrieved a thin folder and placed it on the table between them. Jessica opened it slowly. Inside were scanned images of meeting minutes, faded newspaper clippings, and a handwritten entry in a town ledger, the script narrow and almost nervous. There was an incident, Marla said, almost to herself. Something with the Grange family. It didn't make the papers properly, just whispers in council meetings. And then it vanished. But someone remembered, Jessica murmured. Marla nodded once, then looked away. Jessica carefully traced her fingers across the page. The ink had faded in places, but the handwriting was surprisingly legible. The entry was dated August 17, 1948. A brief note, signed by a council secretary, recording a matter of concern involving the Grange household and one minor child placed under temporary supervision. No names, no explanations, just a footnote in the town's otherwise tidy narrative. Jessica looked up. This seems deliberately vague. Marla folded her arms. It was. Back then, families with influence could lean heavily on the virtue of discretion. Jessica's eyes flicked to another line, a reference to county social services. Do you have anything from the foster placement system? No files, Marla replied. But I remember my predecessor mentioning a sealed request made by someone in town, under initials, not names. Jessica paused. Do the initials match Eleanor Grange? Marla didn't answer directly. Instead, she moved toward a shelf and pulled down a register with trembling fingers. Some things were kept separate, quietly, not officially catalogued. Inside was a slim note attached to a clipped file. On it, in a precise, deliberate hand, were the initials E.G. and a phrase beneath it, emergency relocation, discretion advised. Jessica's chest tightened. The pieces were not yet in place, but the pattern was forming. It was a single line on an aging index card, misfiled between census forms and agricultural reports. Reeves, Dominic, minor, assigned to foster care Wyndham Company, status unclaimed. Jessica stared at it, her breath caught. No date of birth, no next of kin, just that name, and the suggestion that he had arrived alone, and remained so. Is this the only record? She asked. Marla nodded slowly. It shouldn't be, but yes, one card, nothing else. How does a child enter the system without background? Marla hesitated, then sat down across from her. Sometimes, she said carefully, it's not that the background doesn't exist, it's that no one wants to put it on paper. Jessica turned the card over. Blank. He was erased, she murmured. Or hidden, Marla added. Not everyone agreed with how things were handled, but those who spoke up didn't stay long in Sycamore Glen. Jessica let the silence settle again. A child removed from the records, a file half kept, and now decades later, a man returning with a name no one dared claim. She closed her notebook gently. This was no longer about speculation. This was about a boy whose story had been written in invisible ink, and someone had hoped it would never be read. Marla rose and crossed to the narrow window that overlooked the churchyard. Her voice, when she spoke, was distant. People here don't like to dig up old things. They say it disturbs the peace. But the truth is, the peace has always been resting on something uneasy. Jessica stood quietly beside her. What happened in 1948? Marla hesitated. The Grange household was in crisis. Eleanor's brother, Henry, had come back from the war, changed. There were whispers about an affair. A child born out of wedlock. It wasn't discussed in public, but people knew, or pretended not to. And Dominic, placed in care, I think, quietly. Someone must have made sure his name disappeared. Jessica folded her arms. The secrecy was protective at first, but eventually it just became self-serving. Marla gave a small nod. And now, with him dead, it's a debt finally coming due. Jessica felt the weight of those words settle into the room like dust. The past hadn't faded. It had only settled deeper, layered under respectability, under time, under names, carved neatly into wooden plaques. She glanced at the ledger again, her eyes drawn to the margins. Someone somewhere had known the cost of silence, and chosen to pay it anyway. Jessica sat in the quiet of the reading room, her notebook open before her, its pages now filled with facts that didn't sit flat, like stones pressed into the earth by uncertain hands. Reeves, Dominic, fostered out, no known parents, year matched, initials matched, and now, dead. She stared at the card once more. It didn't prove anything, not legally, but the absence of record said more than presence. It suggested shame, perhaps fear, and it pointed toward a pattern that could no longer be denied. Could Eleanor Grange have known? Not just known of him, but known him. Was her letter not simply a gesture of memory, but something closer to guilt? Jessica closed the folder slowly, her thoughts aligning like puzzle pieces forming along the edges. If Dominic had discovered the truth of his origins, if he'd come not for vengeance, but for recognition, what had he found in Sycamore Glen? Closed doors, quiet warnings, avoided gazes, and someone who had something to lose. Jessica stood. "Thank you, Marla, for trusting me." Marla didn't smile, but her voice softened. "I think someone should know, even if it's too late." Jessica nodded, but in her gut she knew it wasn't too late. Not quite. As Jessica made her way out, her fingers brushed along a row of worn hymnals stacked near the door. One, older than the others, bore initials carved faintly into the inside cover. She turned it in her hands, and beneath the name, scratched faintly with what looked like a penknife, was a date: July 1948. No surname, no title, just a boy's initials in a church book, quietly claiming space no one had offered him. Jessica held it for a moment longer before replacing it. Not all ghosts left footprints. Some left marks you had to know how to read. The sun sat low behind the trees as Jessica and Eleanor Grange strolled the wooded path behind the churchyard, their footsteps softened by fallen leaves. It was Eleanor's suggestion, a bit of air before dinner she'd called it, though Jessica suspected she needed distance from eyes and ears more than fresh oxygen. For a time they walked in silence, the breeze rustling lightly through the sycamores. Jessica let it stretch, not out of politeness, but respect. Some silences had to be met before they could be crossed. "You must find us terribly odd," Eleanor said at last, "this little town, with its secrets tucked in every hedgerow." Jessica offered a gentle smile. "Every town has its secrets, but yours seem quietly guarded." Eleanor's jaw tightened, then released. We were raised to preserve dignity, and sometimes that meant preserving silence. Jessica said nothing. It was my brother, Eleanor continued after a moment. Henry, he made mistakes. We all did, but we tried to keep the damage contained. Jessica's heart stirred at the word. Damage. There was a child, wasn't there? Eleanor didn't look at her. There was a boy, but it wasn't my place to decide what happened next. She spoke the last part more to the trees than to Jessica, and before Jessica could ask more, Eleanor touched her sleeve lightly. Some truths, Jessica, are too old to serve anyone now. Jessica nodded slowly, but she wasn't sure Eleanor believed that, and she knew she didn't. Walter Briggs's home was a study in restraint. Dark wood panels, orderly bookshelves, a grandfather clock that ticked with the rhythm of a courtroom. He greeted Jessica with formal politeness, offering tea in porcelain cups and a chair by the fireplace that creaked only once as she sat. "You've been asking about 1948, he said without preamble. Jessica inclined her head, only because it seems no one else will. He sipped his tea, then set the cup down with precision. That year brought difficulties. Not everything made it into the public record, because it was inconvenient. Jessica asked gently. Because it was dangerous, he said. To reputations, to the stability of this community. Jessica watched him carefully. There was a child placed in foster care. With no name, no family. He folded his hands. I recall the matter. A troubled situation, best handled quietly. It was wartime fallout. Emotional debris, you might say. And Dominic Reeves, a flicker of discomfort passed over his features. He came here looking for accountability, but not all truths restore balance. Some only erode it. Jessica let the silence speak for a moment. Was it justice, she asked softly, or protection? Briggs didn't answer. He rose, adjusted a book on the shelf without purpose, then added, "Sometimes mercy must be practiced in silence." Jessica left shortly after, but the word mercy echoed behind her like a closing door, deliberate, final, and possibly misplaced. Naomi Elkins lived in a small cottage lined with flowering vines that belied the tremor in her hands and the guilt folded in her eyes. Jessica was invited in without hesitation, but sensed from the start that this would not be a conversation of ease. "I remember Dominic," Naomi said, holding a teacup she never sipped from, though not by name then, just a boy with two old eyes. Jessica leaned in gently. "What happened to him?" Naomi looked toward the window. "He cried a lot at first. Wouldn't speak. Then one day, he asked if the bridge would remember him." Jessica blinked. "The bridge," Naomi nodded. "He said he'd left something there. Something important." Her hands shook harder now, the tea rippling quietly. "We weren't trained for this sort of thing. The county told us to offer kindness. But what do you offer a child who's been discarded?" Jessica waited. "He stayed only 2 weeks. Then someone came and moved him again. No records, no notice, just gone." "Who came?" Naomi's voice dropped. "Someone from here. But I was told not to ask." Jessica's breath caught. Naomi turned to her, eyes wet. "I've carried that silence for decades, Jessica. And I'm tired of it." Jessica reached out, covering Naomi's shaking hand with her own. Naomi flinched, not from fear, but from the terrible weight of memory resurfacing. Reverend Harlan Cobb met Jessica in the church garden, pruning late roses with surprising delicacy. He looked up as she approached, his smile measured but not unkind. "Imagine you've heard quite a range of accounts by now," he said, as he snipped a fading blossom, "and found them all incomplete." Jessica gave a soft laugh. "You might say that. He gestured for her to walk with him along the path. The church was smaller then. So was the town. We didn't have the luxury of distance. What one family suffered, the whole town absorbed. Jessica let that linger, then asked, "Do you remember the child?" Cobb paused, eyes fixed on the shears. "I remember a boy whose silence was deeper than most sermons. He clung to the porch railing for dear life. I sat beside him once, asked his name. He just shook his head. Did you know who he was? I had suspicions. We all did, but there was a sense unspoken but powerful, that to name him was to break something fragile." "Whose fragility were you protecting?" Jessica asked gently. Cobb sighed. "Some believed we were guarding innocence. Others feared scandal. Either way the boy disappeared, and the bridge became just wood and nails again." Jessica felt a chill brush her thoughts. "There is no absolution without truth," she said. Cobb glanced up at the bell tower. "No, but sometimes we convince ourselves that silence is close enough." Back in her room at the inn, Jessica spread her notes across the quilted bedspread. 4 voices, 4 accounts, and not one that truly aligned. Each speaker had offered a version of the past, but what struck Jessica wasn't contradiction in detail. It was the sameness in their omissions. The boy, Dominic, had been mentioned, but never claimed. His presence acknowledged, but his pain quietly skirted. Eleanor had deflected. Walter had defended. Naomi had suffered. Reverend Cobb had spiritualized. And through it all, Jessica sensed one consistent note: fear, not of the truth itself, but of what it might awaken. She flipped back to Naomi's description. He asked if the bridge would remember him. That line clung to her like damp linen. Jessica circled a phrase in her notebook. "Someone from here came to take him." She set her pen down, leaning back. Whoever that someone was, they had a name not yet spoken. Not all lies were spoken aloud. Some were wrapped in reverent tones and allowed to pass as wisdom, but the bridge hadn't forgotten, and neither had Dominic. Jessica sat in silence, the kind that grows heavier the longer it's held. Outside, the wind rustled the ivy along the inn's wall, and the faint sound of church bells drifted in from the distance, not celebratory, not mournful, just a reminder of time. She thought again of Eleanor's quiet evasion, of Walter's proud justifications, of Naomi's shaking confession, and of Reverend Cobb's soft regret. None had meant harm, not directly, but each had played a part in silencing a boy who had returned as a man, seeking not retribution, but recognition, and now he was gone. Jessica's fingers traced the rim of her teacup, the porcelain cool beneath them. The town had not killed Dominic Reeves, but it had buried him, first in records, then in memory, and now in death. A knock at her door broke the stillness. A letter had been slid beneath it. No envelope, just folded parchment, neat and deliberate. Jessica picked it up. He didn't fall, the note read. He was pushed. Her breath stilled. There was no signature, no mark, just a truth, at last emerging from the silence that had tried so long to contain it. The rain had started as a mist, then gathered into something steady and contemplative, a rhythm tapping on windows, hushing footsteps. Jessica made her way to the old stone church, an umbrella folded beneath her arm, her mind circling the inscription she'd seen etched faintly into the back of the library's hymn book. Dr. July 1948. It wasn't proof, but it was something. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of lemon oil and old wood. The air held that strange stillness unique to churches, as though all words spoken here had agreed to linger. Jessica moved through the nave slowly, eyes tracing the pews, the side chapel, and finally the alcove where the parish records were kept. A door to the rector's office stood slightly ajar. "Reverend Cobb," she called softly. He appeared from behind the curtain that divided the sacristy, still in his vestments, though his face suggested the service had ended some time ago. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, with a nod that tried for warmth, but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Seeking something?" Jessica offered a small smile. "Perhaps, or someone." The Reverend held her gaze for a moment too long, then stepped aside. "You're welcome to look. The past doesn't hide well here, though some would prefer it did." The records room was tucked behind the vestry, a narrow chamber lined with wooden filing cabinets and brittle folders tied with ribbon. A small stained glass window spilled muted color across the shelves, but the corners of the room remained heavy with dust and time. Jessica removed her coat and stepped inside, noting the Reverend didn't follow. He lingered in the doorway, arms folded, like a man standing beside something he no longer claimed. "These are organized chronologically?" Jessica asked, already drawing her fingers across the faded labels. "Roughly," Reverend Cobb replied, "though some years are more complete than others." Jessica tilted her head at that. "Meaning?" He gave a wan smile. "Meaning discretion once outranked documentation, especially when souls were concerned." She nodded slowly, reading between the lines. "But not all souls found peace." He said nothing. Jessica began her search, careful not to disturb more than necessary. The folders were brittle, many barely intact. Donation ledgers, baptism records, committee meeting notes, all whispering the story of a village that had curated its memory. "You'll forgive me," Cobb said, stepping back into the hall, "but I've a funeral to prepare. Do stay as long as you need." Jessica murmured thanks, though her mind was already beneath the surface, chasing the thread the church had tried, for years, to forget. Behind a stack of old hymnals, Jessica noticed something out of place. An old leather-bound Bible, larger than the rest, tucked askew between ledgers and prayer books. It was worn along the spine, its gold lettering barely legible, and bound with a brittle ribbon that had once been red but had since faded to rust. She hesitated a moment, then unwrapped the ribbon and opened the cover. The inside bore a name in looping script, "Presented to the Church of Sycamore Glen, 1946. Below it, a second line had been added in pencil, lighter, more hesitant, "Property of Sunday School, archive only." Jessica flipped carefully through the pages. The margins were littered with faint notations, verses underlined in different inks, names of donors scribbled beside certain psalms. Then near the center, the ribbon's end caught between the pages of Ecclesiastes. Folded between them was something much older, yellowed, delicate, and tucked so precisely it could have gone unnoticed for decades. Jessica drew it free, a photograph, curled at the edges, unlabeled. She paused, the weight of the image in her hand as startling as what she saw within it. Two figures standing beside a low wooden bridge. One, a boy, the other, an adult, and both achingly familiar. Jessica turned toward the faint light from the stained glass window, tilting the photograph gently to see it better. The boy stood at the edge of the footbridge, young, no more than 6 or 7, dressed in a short jacket and knee socks. His hair was tousled, his eyes shaded by the brim of a cap, but there was something unmistakable in the posture. Not just the form of the child, but the intensity, the guardedness, even in stillness. Dominic Reeves. She was almost certain. Beside him, a woman held his hand. Her face was partially turned toward the boy, but the tilt of her head, the high collar of her coat, the dark sweep of her hair, it drew Jessica's breath in. It wasn't Eleanor. Jessica studied the woman's face, piecing together the quiet geometry of recognition. She'd seen that profile in the tea room, the narrow jaw, the eyes that rarely met her own. Naomi Elkins, but Naomi had denied knowing the boy, had spoken of him only in the abstract, a faint memory from a distance. Jessica felt a slow chill rise across her arms. If this photograph was real, and it certainly felt real, then Naomi hadn't simply been a nurse assigned to a brief moment in the boy's life. She had stood beside him, not as a stranger, as something far more personal, and she had lied. The silence that followed in the chapel was not holy. It was concealment, wrapped in memory. Jessica returned to the pew with the photograph still resting in her hand, her mind threading backward through what she'd gathered, the ledger entry, the forgotten file, the initials on the hymn book. There was no longer room for doubt. The boy in the picture was Dominic, and the connection to Eleanor was more than incidental. A nephew, illegitimate, most likely, born to Eleanor's brother Henry, during the summer after the war, whispers of a troubled household. A relocation handled quietly. It explained the missing records, the sealed placement, the Reverend's evasiveness. Jessica recalled Eleanor's hesitation when she'd said, "It wasn't my place to decide what happened next." It hadn't been her place, but it had been her family. The timing matched, the age, the location. The Grange family had shielded its reputation while discarding a boy, not to harm him, perhaps, but to preserve something brittle in themselves. Jessica looked again at Dominic's small hand in Naomi's. She wondered if the boy remembered that moment, or if it had been one more kindness wrapped in confusion, never named. It wasn't vengeance that brought him back to Sycamore Glen. It was identity, the desire not to be erased, and someone, perhaps several people, had chosen to let the past sleep rather than answer for it. Now that past had awakened, and Dominic Reeves, the child they buried in silence, had come home to find the truth. But someone had made sure he would not live long enough to speak it. Jessica studied the image once more. There was no question now. The second figure beside Dominic, the woman holding his hand, was Naomi Elkins, and Naomi had denied knowing him. Not vaguely, not cautiously. She had looked Jessica in the eye and said, "Of course, we all did," as if the boy had been no more than a name whispered once through the halls of a foster system. But this photograph told another story. Naomi had been there at the bridge, not as a bystander, not as a town nurse or guardian ad litem, as someone intimate, as someone trusted. Jessica recalled Naomi's trembling hands, her guilt, her eyes avoiding hers at the tea room when Dominic's name was spoken aloud. Why deny it? Why erase that connection? Unless there was something more. Perhaps she hadn't failed him then, but feared what it would mean to admit she had failed him later. Or perhaps she hadn't failed him at all. Jessica slipped the photograph into her notebook. Her pulse had slowed, but her thoughts raced. The lie had weight, and its presence, like the boy's, had returned to Sycamore Glen for a reckoning. Somewhere in Naomi's silence lived the reason Dominic had died, and Jessica was ready to listen. Back in her room at the inn, Jessica unfolded the photograph and laid it beside her notebook. Naomi Elkins stood clearly in frame, hand in hand with the boy she had claimed to remember only vaguely. That lie had been quiet, but unmistakable. Jessica flipped through her notes. Naomi had said Dominic stayed with her for 2 weeks, maybe less, that no records were kept, that he cried often, spoke little, and was soon moved again, a file erased. But the photograph, dated July 1948 in faded ink, showed him smiling faintly, comfortable, trusting. It wasn't the posture of a stranger to the woman beside him. Jessica reached for the page where she'd transcribed Eleanor's account. "It wasn't my place to decide what happened next," Eleanor had said. And yet, if Naomi had once played a maternal role, even for a short time, she had been part of that decision. There was one more discrepancy. Naomi said she hadn't recognized Dominic until she overheard his name in the tea room, but Jessica now recalled the tremor in her hands, not at his name, but at the sight of him. The lies weren't in what Naomi said, they were in what she chose to leave unsaid, and Jessica, with the photograph now firm in her hand, understood something deeper. Naomi hadn't been avoiding guilt, she'd been avoiding grief. The sky had turned to pewter by the time Jessica made her way to Naomi Elkin's cottage, a narrow house tucked behind an overgrown hedge, with the shutters drawn, though it was only late afternoon. The gate creaked softly beneath her touch, a sound that seemed to echo across the silent garden. She knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Naomi stood there, cardigan wrapped tightly around her, eyes tired but not surprised. "I thought it might be you," she said quietly. "Come in." The interior smelled faintly of old books and rose water. A kettle hissed gently in the background, forgotten. Jessica noticed a chair positioned near the window, one cushion indented, as if Naomi had been sitting and watching the road. She had been waiting. Jessica reached into her bag and withdrew the photograph, holding it out. As Naomi took it without flinching, "You kept this?" she asked, her voice nearly a whisper. "It was in the church Bible," Jessica replied, "carefully placed, almost hidden." Naomi didn't answer at first. She touched the edge of the photograph, brushing her thumb across the child's coat sleeve. "I thought it was gone. I had hoped it was." Jessica waited. Naomi's hand trembled. "I lied to you," she said finally, "because I thought forgetting would keep it from hurting." Jessica met her gaze gently. "But it didn't, did it?" Naomi closed her eyes. "No," she whispered, "it never did." They sat across from one another at a small table draped in lace. Naomi cradled the photograph between her palms as though it were still warm. "He was just a little boy," she began, eyes unfocused. "They told me his mother had died. No father listed. He was being held until a placement could be arranged. Temporary, they said." She drew in a shaking breath. "He was quiet at first, but not frightened. He loved the morning walks to the river. We used to stop at the bridge. He'd throw pebbles into the water, counting the ripples." Jessica watched her, saying nothing. "I wasn't meant to grow attached," Naomi went on, "but he called me Nan. Not Mama, not Miss Elkins. Just Nan." She paused, then continued. "Then one day, a man came, no badge, no explanation, just said the boy was to be moved immediately. I wasn't given a choice." Jessica's voice was low. "And you never saw him again?" Naomi shook her head. "Not until last week. He walked into the tea room, tall and unfamiliar. But those eyes, they were the same." She looked down at the photo again. "He didn't recognize me, but I knew, every part of me knew." Jessica leaned forward. "Why didn't you say something?" Naomi swallowed hard. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what he remembered. Afraid of what I'd failed to do." Her voice broke. "I didn't protect him then, and I didn't know how to face him now." The clock ticked softly behind them, each second marking a space between Naomi's words. "I followed him," she said at last. "That night, after the tea room, I saw him walking toward the bridge. The same path we used to take." Jessica's heart quickened, but she stayed quiet. "I didn't plan to speak to him. I just wanted to see him again, make sure I wasn't imagining it. But when I stepped onto the bridge, he turned and said, 'I thought someone might follow.'" Naomi's hands, folded now on the table, gripped one another tightly. "He knew, I don't know how, but he knew who I was, or had been. He asked me why I let them take him, why I didn't come for him." She looked up, eyes wet. "How do you answer that, Jessica?" Jessica didn't. I tried, Naomi whispered. Tried to tell him I was young, that I had no authority, but he kept asking, "Did you even try to stop them?" And I realized I hadn't. I'd let it happen. I told myself I had no choice. Naomi's voice cracked now, barely audible. He stepped toward me, not threatening, just close. He looked so lost, and I panicked. Jessica's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. I reached out, put a hand to his arm. I meant to steady myself, but he backed up, too fast, too far, and he slipped. She covered her face. There was no scream, just the sound of his body hitting the water. Jessica sat still, allowing the words to settle into the room like ash. Naomi's face had grown pale, but not blank. It was a face full of feeling, too many feelings, tangled and years too late. "I didn't mean to hurt him," Naomi said quietly. "I didn't want to. I swear it." "I believe you," Jessica said. Naomi glanced up in disbelief. "You were afraid." "Guilt isn't a motive, Naomi, but it is a weight, and it can make people act without thinking." Naomi looked down. "It wasn't just guilt, it was shame. I told myself I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't hit him, hadn't pushed him. But in that moment, when he slipped, I knew." Jessica folded her hands together, steady and calm. "You've been carrying this alone for decades." Naomi nodded, and I thought maybe if I stayed quiet it would go away. But he came back, Jessica. Not to hurt anyone, just to ask why. Jessica's throat tightened, and no one could give him an answer. Naomi wiped her cheek with the edge of her sleeve. "I didn't tell anyone, not even after he fell. I just walked away. I told myself someone would find him, that maybe it was an accident, that if no one knew, it didn't have to mean anything." Jessica exhaled slowly. "But you knew it meant everything." Naomi didn't reply. Her silence said enough. Jessica reached into her bag and took out the folded note. "He didn't fall, he was pushed." She placed it gently between them. The sheriff's cruiser pulled into the gravel drive as dusk spread gently over the village. Jessica stood by the garden gate, coat drawn around her, watching the headlights cut through the fog. Inside, Naomi had returned to her chair, the photograph of Dominic now resting on her lap, like a confession that needed no words. As the sheriff approached the door, Naomi rose. "I'll speak with him," she said, not with bravado, but with something closer to resolve. "It's time." Jessica followed her to the door, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder. "The truth may not fix everything, Naomi, but it's the only place anything begins." Naomi looked at her, eyes worn but clear. "Do you think he would have forgiven me?" Jessica's answer came after a pause. "I don't know, but I think he came here hoping someone would say they remembered, that he mattered." Naomi's breath caught. Jessica stepped back as the sheriff met them on the porch. Words were exchanged softly, almost formally. Naomi didn't resist. She simply nodded once and stepped into the night air. Before the door closed, Naomi turned. "Jessica, is silence always wrong?" Jessica didn't answer directly. She looked toward the darkening road, then back at the woman who had lived too long beneath the burden of omission. "Silence can protect," she said finally, "but it can also destroy. It all depends on what and who we're trying to keep safe." Naomi bowed her head, and with that the past stepped into the light. Morning came gently to Sycamore Glen, casting the village in a soft silvery glow. A quiet stillness lingered, not from sleep, but from something more solemn, a reverence for the day ahead. Jessica stood at her window, watching as two young girls in matching coats wove ribbons through the railing posts at the edge of the bridge. Their laughter, hushed and fleeting, floated up like mist and dissolved into the morning air. On the far bank, a small group of volunteers arranged folding chairs in neat rows. Someone brought a basket of flowers. Someone else placed a small table draped in linen at the foot of the bridge. Everything was understated, precise. Jessica took her tea without haste, the warmth steady in her hands. She had not slept much, but she had slept deeply, a kind of sleep that came not from resolution, but from having finally faced something long left buried. The bridge gleamed faintly in the light. It had been scrubbed, polished, freshly painted, but no amount of care could erase the fact that this bridge, this quiet piece of wood and memory, now held the weight of a name spoken too late. Still, the town had come to remember, and that, Jessica thought, was a beginning. By mid-morning, a modest crowd had gathered. There were no reporters, no cameras, no press releases, only the townspeople of Sycamore Glen, dressed with simple care, standing in a gentle semicircle around the bridge's mouth. Some held small posies. Others carried thermoses of coffee, their breaths curling faintly in the crisp air. Jessica stood toward the back, near the edge of a rosebush that had only just begun to bloom. She noticed how people kept their voices low, their greetings brief, as if acknowledging something too large for words. The ceremony began without fanfare. Reverend Cobb offered a few lines of prayer, not stiff, but tender, asking for healing, for mercy, for peace in places long quieted by fear. His voice wavered once, and Jessica saw him glance down, perhaps at the plaque, perhaps at his own shoes. Eleanor Grange stepped forward next, flanked by two younger townsfolk. In her hands, she held a single ribbon, white silk, slightly frayed at one edge. A pair of silver scissors gleamed in the morning sun. She looked out at the bridge, then the water, and then at the crowd. No words, just breath. And then, with a steady hand, she cut the ribbon. It fluttered to the ground. A moment passed, long and silent, before the first person stepped forward and crossed the span. It was not a triumphant walk, but it was deliberate. And that, Jessica thought, was a kind of grace. Later, once the bridge had seen its first footsteps in years, Eleanor stepped once more before the gathered crowd, this time alone. A light breeze moved her skirt against her legs, but her posture remained steady, as if the years she carried had found new footing in her spine. She didn't speak from a podium, no amplification, just her voice, soft and sure, offered to those willing to listen. This bridge, she began, was once just a means of crossing, from one place to another. A shortcut, some called it, a place to pass through. Her eyes lingered on the railing, and Jessica saw the faintest flicker of pain. But it was also a place of silence, of pause, of things left unspoken. She didn't name Dominic, nor did she name Naomi, or Henry, or herself, yet each sentence seemed etched with their presence. There are moments, Eleanor continued, when truth doesn't arrive with answers, but with acknowledgement. When healing means not forgetting, but remembering, kindly, quietly, as best we can. She held up a small white rose, and placed it carefully at the base of the new plaque. To those we failed, she said, her voice catching just once, and those we remember. The crowd stood still. Jessica felt something shift, not in sound, but in the air, in the release of something old, and in Eleanor's eyes, she saw not peace exactly, but permission to begin again. As the ceremony drew to a close, Jessica allowed her gaze to move across the gathered faces. There was no applause, no public display of catharsis, but there didn't need to be. What mattered was in the details. Naomi Elkins stood a few steps behind the sheriff, her hair gently pinned, her coat too thin for the weather. Her posture was calm, not proud. She looked not at the crowd, but at the bridge, and once very briefly, toward Jessica. Walter Briggs lingered at the edge, hands clasped behind his back, eyes shadowed. He had said little since Naomi's confession, and perhaps that was for the best. Some reckonings came not through speech, but quiet contemplation. Reverend Cobb had knelt beside the flowers Eleanor had laid. He straightened slowly, carefully, as if the weight of the years they all had buried had finally found shape in stone. Jessica noted the younger faces too, those who hadn't lived through the summer of 1948, but would inherit the memory now shaped by truth, not omission. There were no villains here, just people, some with regrets, some with relief. Some, like Eleanor, with nothing more than the courage to speak softly where once they had remained silent. Long after the chairs had been folded and the crowd had dispersed in twos and threes, Jessica remained near the bridge. She walked to its center, her gloved fingers grazing the smooth rail where Dominic had once stood and where he had fallen. The water below moved gently, its surface catching glints of sun between the branches. It seemed to whisper rather than flow, not urgent, not insistent, but patient, as if it had always known what others had tried to forget. Jessica leaned slightly over the edge, watching the way the water curled around the stones, how it remembered the shape of the land without judgment. She thought of Dominic, a boy once lost to silence, returned as a man seeking only a name, a place, a truth. He had not come to accuse, he had come to ask, and that perhaps had frightened them more. Jessica drew from her pocket a folded note, the anonymous message that had first pierced the veil of secrecy. He didn't fall, he was pushed. There was no need to keep it now. She released it, gently, over the side. It floated for a moment, then dipped beneath the current, and was gone. Not buried, not erased, given back to the water, and with it Jessica whispered, not a prayer but a promise, that silence would no longer be the only voice Sycamore Glen offered its lost. Jessica found Eleanor sitting alone on a bench beneath the sycamores, her hands folded in her lap, gaze turned toward the river. She didn't look up as Jessica approached, but her voice was steady when she spoke. It's strange how heavy something can feel after it's been set down. Jessica nodded, lowering herself onto the bench beside her. Truth has a weight all its own, sometimes heavier than lies, but lighter in the long run. Eleanor smiled faintly. You were right to come. No, Jessica said, you were right to ask. They sat in quiet for a moment, letting the sounds of the river fill the space between words. He wasn't mine, Eleanor murmured, but I loved him, in the quiet way you love a wound you never quite let heal. Jessica reached out, covering her hand. Love, even unspoken, still leaves a trace. Eleanor looked at her now, eyes shimmering but dry. Thank you. Jessica stood, adjusting her scarf. Goodbye, Eleanor. Goodbye, Jessica. As she walked back toward the inn, Jessica felt the final strands of the past loosen behind her, not severed, but no longer knotted. Farewell didn't mean forgetting, it meant remembering, differently. Jessica's suitcase rested lightly on the back seat of the departing town car as Sycamore Glen faded in the rear view. The trees whispered alongside the road, and the river ran its quiet course just beyond the bend. She turned once in her seat, just before the village disappeared from view. The bridge was still visible, small, dignified, enduring. She thought of Dominic's face, of Naomi's trembling hands, of Eleanor's quiet courage, and of truth, not loud, not dramatic, but patient, waiting like water under wood. The road stretched ahead, winding gently toward Cabot Cove, where her typewriter and rose garden would be waiting. But part of her, the part that understood sorrow without needing to fix it, would linger a little while longer on the banks of Sycamore Glen, not because the story wasn't finished, but because it had at last been told. Some truths don't demand justice or vengeance, only the quiet dignity of being spoken aloud at last. But I wonder, if Dominic hadn't returned, Would Sycamore Glen have ever faced the silence it built to survive? What do you think? Was it mercy or fear that kept the past hidden for so long? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, I'd be delighted if you'd share it. Leave a like and subscribe for more journeys into the heart of mystery and memory.